So today's debate will discuss the use of functional analysis, which is an experimental alteration of conditions to elicit problem behaviors in order to determine the function of that behavior, versus the use of functional behavior assessments, which is a method of collecting information about a problem behavior via indirect assessments and direct observations to determine the function. The FBA versus FA issue is an important one for all practicing behavior analysts because we have Ethical Code 3.01 regarding behavior analytic assessment. The code states that behavior analysts conduct current assessments prior to making recommendations or developing behavior change programs. The type of assessment used is determined by clients' needs and consent, environmental parameters, and other contextual variables. When behavior analysts are developing a behavior reduction program, they must first conduct a functional assessment, whether that be the FBA or the FA. So on the pro-FA side, we have our pro-stater, Allison Connor. We have the pro-prover, Caitlin Holmes, and the pro-attacker, Brandy Blankenbeckler. On the con side, which is going to be providing support for FAs, we have the con-stater, Catherine Myers, the con-prover, Erin Walton, and the con-attacker, Catherine Myers.
So first, let's discuss an FBA. An FBA is a functional behavior assessment that is a process conducted where the individual conducting the assessment directly observes the individual and examines the antecedents, or what happens before the behavior occurs, the problem behaviors, and the consequences, or what happens after the behavior. And these are observed to determine the function served by the behavior. And here is an example of an ABC chart. And here you can see this is where you record what happens before the behavior itself and what happens after. It is important to note that the behavior might not always be the same problem behavior, and the consequences are also likely to not be the same as well. So the reason behind that is going to be because the individuals that we serve are likely to have multiple problem behaviors, and those behaviors might serve different functions as well. Within educational settings in which FBAs are used, the information is gathered using both indirect and direct descriptive procedures. Descriptive methods of assessment establish a correlation between the behavior and either the antecedent or the consequence variable. Indirect methods include interviews with parents, teachers, and children using questionnaires, rating scales, and record reviews. Direct measures typically consist of scatter plots and observation worksheets such as the ABC chart that was just shown. FBAs are being seen a lot more. One reason for this is the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA. It requires clinicians to conduct an FBA before individuals with disabilities can be placed on an individualized educational plan. As a result of that, FBA procedures have experienced an increased emphasis. FBAs do not require specialized and intense training that is required by a functional analysis, and they also do not require a large amount of time. FBAs involve observing behavior in a natural occurrence and therefore do not require manipulations that result in intentional increases of the problem behaviors. And this will be discussed later as well.
All right, I'm going to discuss a little bit about what an FA is. In an FA, you typically have 4 conditions: play, alone, attention, and escape. And in each of these conditions, you're going to manipulate the environment or the situation to pretty much cause the client to have behavior. It sounds terrible, but so for instance, in like the escape condition, you would give them like an undesired task or situation and see if that caused them to have a behavior in order to escape that situation. In the attention condition, you would deny them any attention and see if that lack of attention would cause them to have behavior to gain attention. Your playing condition is going to be your control condition. So in that one, you're going to allow the client to play with preferred toys, and you're going to be giving them some attention, but not a whole lot. And that's going to be your control to see if they engage in behavior when they're engaging in preferred activities. And then your final condition is alone, and that's going to be to test for some stereotypy and to see if they engage in behaviors when there's no environmental things going on around them that could potentially cause behavior other than being by themselves. And so in a functional analysis, you get some objective and quantitative data, and you can see behavior in a relevant setting, and you're able to control those conditions. You are then able to compare the test and control conditions, and that comparison shows a clear cause and effect relationship. The results of a functional analysis give you a clear basis for treatment development. Once you know the function, you can create a function-based intervention and come up with replacement behaviors that have the same function. In almost all published accounts, functional analysis represents the gold standard for validity tests. The functional analysis can identify causal and maintaining factors of problem behaviors and has led to the development of effective treatments for problem behaviors. The structure and conditional quality of a functional analysis makes replication possible. The functional analysis allows the researcher to base treatments on observable and recorded functions of behavior. In 1994, Horner wrote that although different situations may require different functional assessment procedures, experimental functional analysis will remain the expectation within published research. Findings indicate that treatments based on functional analysis are more successful at suppressing problematic behaviors when compared to those based on functional behavior assessments. So now I'm going to show you some charts from a functional analysis. So here's one. The data has been input into the chart after the FA data collection and manipulation, and you can see there's actually 5 different conditions in this one, and you can see that they're represented by the different colored shapes on the graph. And then in the second one, the function is a little more clear. It's very clearly attention maintained. You can see that because the data points for the attention condition are much higher than the alone, escape, and free play conditions.
So now I'm going to be providing some statistics that support the reason why FBAs are used more frequently than FAs by practicing BCBAs, as was mentioned earlier. In a paper titled Statewide Survey Assessing Practitioners' Use and Utility of Functional Assessment by Roscoe, Kelly, Farber, and Dube, it was found that of the 205 respondents, only 34.6% of them relied on functional analysis to inform the development of behavior plans. On the other hand, 62% reported that they conducted descriptive assessments, which are your ABC data and your scatter plots, either alone or in combination with indirect assessments, which are your interviews and rating scales, to inform their behavior plans. So there's a much heavier use of FBAs over FAs to inform behavior plans. Additionally, the study found that 84.4% reported that they use the descriptive assessments most frequently, while only 21% used functional analysis most frequently. So there is a large discrepancy in the use of FBA versus FA, and this can be attributed to certain economic and societal factors. As mentioned by our pro-stater, FBAs do not require as much time, resources, or training to complete as a functional analysis does. In a study titled A Survey of Functional Behavior Assessment Methods Used by Behavior Analysts in Practice by Oliver, Pratt, and Normand, there was 682 respondents that were questioned about the barriers that stood in their way to using a functional analysis. And of those respondents, 57% reported that a lack of time stood as a barrier to using a functional analysis. 51% reported a lack of space and materials as a barrier, and 27% reported a lack of trained staff to assist with the FA as a barrier. So with these economic barriers, FBAs tend to be a more viable and realistic option, especially for practitioners that have very limited time and resources. Another factor for why FBAs are used more frequently is that they don't require intentionally provoking a behavior to occur like a functionalist analysis does. And this makes an FBA more acceptable for use, especially with behaviors that are self-injurious or dangerous or harmful aggressions. So in the same study by Oliver, 22% of the respondents reported that they lacked support for using FAs, either from their administration or from the families. And this kind of shows that that lack of support also comes from a lack of acceptability for the FA. And then also there was 25% of respondents that reported having administrative policies in place that actually prohibit the use of an FA. So in these cases, the FBA is the only option that those practitioners have to inform their behavior development plans or behavior intervention plans. And then another important statistic to know is that many practitioners find FBAs to be just as informative and useful as an FA. The Oliver study reported that over 90% of respondents agreed that FBAs are essential for developing effective interventions, and over 50% felt that the descriptive assessments, again, your ABC data collection, were just as useful as a functional analysis. So when you have FBAs requiring less time, less resources, less training, and times being more acceptable, and also being just as useful and informative, it makes sense why an FBA would be used more frequently than an FA.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros to using a functional analysis. Like mentioned before, using a functional analysis provides more objective and quantitative data through the use of manipulating controlled conditions of alone, play, escape, and attention. And because you're able to manipulate those conditions, you have clear data to back up the cause and effect relationship between the problem behavior and the function that's maintaining it. That will allow the practitioners to develop a clear and effective treatment plan to decrease that problem behavior. Also, from an ethical standpoint, it's more effective because there's a clear written way to carry out the behavior intervention plan. So that provides more staff fidelity in terms of how that intervention is carried out from staff member to staff member, which also will increase the likelihood that the intervention is effective. There's a couple of code of ethic points that also come into play here. Our Code of Ethics 4.03a says that behavior analysts must tailor a behavior change program to unique behaviors, environmental variables, assessment results, and the goals of each individual client. And when using a functional analysis, the behavior analyst is going to be able to achieve that a little bit better than using a functional behavior assessment, because it does manipulate the settings and give objective results to an individual's unique behaviors, and it does look at environmental variables such as the individual's home or school or treatment center. And there's also an assessment piece at the end where you're looking at the results and determining whether or not the intervention needs to be changed in any way. Also, the Code of Ethics 4.07b talks about environmental conditions. It says if the environmental conditions hinder the implementation of the behavior change program, then the behavior analyst needs to eliminate the environmental constraints or at least identify in writing why they're unable to eliminate those environmental constraints. Using a functional analysis is going to provide more information in the context of environmental conditions than a functional behavior assessment, because once again, we're looking at manipulating those that behavior across multiple environments. In terms of acceptability, like it was mentioned before, in the scientific community, the functional analysis is viewed as that gold standard because it is so reliant on objective data collection. And so one way to make it more acceptable in the non-scientific community or just everyone else would be to maybe use less jargon and break down the terminology and put the emphasis on why collecting objective data is going to be more beneficial in the end than some of the anecdotal data that's collected with the functional behavior assessment.
I'm going to move in and talk about pros of a functional analysis. A functional analysis are known to be difficult to implement because they need to follow a prescribed sequence of interactions, and that's in a consistent manner. Functional analysis are also known to be used less common, although in saying that, they can still be implemented in clinical. Functional analysis refers to any empirical demonstration of cause and effect relation, and the applications that are applied are unique. The ability to apply a functional analysis can be constricted by the lack of time that is available to conduct an FA. So then a BFA, which is a brief functional analysis, is completed, and the time needed for that is 90 minutes. Cons to a functional analysis are listed. They have alterations are made to the environment, and that alters the frequency of behaviors. Establishing operants are neglected to be identified. Antecedents and consequences are not looked at or evaluated because there are manipulations made to the environment. Extremely time consuming due to multiple sessions that can be completed to gain enough data. It is not cost effective, and that's due to multiple sessions. It's also due to the manipulations that are made to the environment and the extensive training that's needed to conduct a functional analysis. While the sessions are longer and add to the time of the constraint, analyzing the data that was gathered during a functional analysis, it's not included, and it does add to the time that is needed. When life-threatening behaviors become present, such as self-injurious behaviors, this can call for immediate attention, and it also can has vital consequences. The functional analysis are time-consuming, require extensive training, and are not cost-effective, like mentioned before. When assessing a severe behavior problem that is threatening, such as self-injurious behaviors, The time constraint may have vital consequences, and immediate attention may be necessary. Limitations in mental health. Funding have exposed to monetary constraints on using functional analysis as an automatic prelude to behavior treatment. Also, the FA methodology described previously neglects to identify the establishing operants and minimizes the relevance of understanding antecedent manipulations. Researchers have noted other limitations of functional analysis procedures, and this includes collecting data within non-naturalistic environments, intentional increases in life-threatening maladaptive behaviors.
So now I will be discussing some cons to an FBA. In various studies, indirect assessments and descriptive analysis have not reliably produced the same function that was found through functional analysis. Functional behavior assessments are less thorough and more susceptible to recorder biases. This is because you're simply just watching what happens throughout the individual's day. So something could happen directly after behavior that could possibly not be what's reinforcing that behavior, but as you see it, and that's directly what happens after the behavior, you could think that that is the reinforcing event, and it actually is something completely unrelated. FBAs rely heavily on data from indirect observation, whereas in an FA, you're directly manipulating the environment to cause the behavior to happen. Highly subjective data, poor reliability, questionable validity, and insufficient treatment development are all qualities of the FBA. Again, you're relying basically on what the observer sees and how they interpret that information. Also, they require lengthy observations and interpretation based on conditional probabilities.
So to wrap up with the pros for FBA, they are performed quickly yet still effectively, which is extremely important due to the high need for assessment following the IDEA standards, and also for the heavy caseloads of behavior analysis. Currently in the field, behavior analysis are in high demand, which is resulting in the current BCBAs having high caseloads, and they have many clients that they have to do assessments for all of them. FBAs also occur in a natural setting, which does not require changing the environment to intentionally increase a problematic behavior. Doing that can be considered unethical because as behavior analysts, we do not want to cause risk of harm to anyone. So if we are assessing a behavior that is self-injurious or maybe injury to others, we would not want to purposely increase that to get an assessment.
So to wrap up, the FA functional analysis involves more in-depth manipulation of variables to create a more precise relationship between the conditions and the behavior. Without knowing the functional relationship, it is impossible to create an effective treatment plan that includes appropriate replacement behaviors containing that same function.
All right, that wraps up our debate portion of a presentation, and we're going to open it up to some questions now. Our first question is, how could you respond ethically to a coworker who is a BCBA and is frustrated the principal of a school she consults in will not permit her to conduct an FA? And we'll turn it over to Brandy to answer that one.
To respond to that question, we would look at the Ethical Code 2.09, which is clients have a right to effective treatment. The behavior analysis needs to make sure that they are advocating for their client and as well educate the clients about scientific and appropriate treatment. So if the principal did deny conducting an FA, we would talk about the reasons that he listed, and then we would present it to the school board to ensure that there was in all across the board reasoning to why the functional analysis has been denied, to ensure that you are able to provide effective treatment for your client and that all observations and data has been collected effectively.
All right, thank you, Brandy. Our second question is, how would you explain the differences between an FBA and an FA to the parent of a client who just started to receive ABA services? We're going to turn it to Allison for that answer.
So first, when talking to any parent or guardian of a client who just started ABA services, it's important to not use jargon because they're not going to be familiar with the technical terms that those of us in the field are going to be aware of. So first, to explain the difference to these to a parent, I would explain that a functional analysis is more of an experimental form of assessment in which the environment is changed to cause the behavior. This is similar to scientific experiments that we all learn about in like grade school and high school. And I would also explain that a functional behavior assessment is an assessment where we observe the behavior occurring naturally and then examine those observation recordings to determine why the child is engaging in the behavior. And I would also explain to the parent that they can expect multiple behaviors to occur, and the same behavior doesn't always have the same function, and that's why we do the observations for several occurrences of behavior.
Thank you, Allison. Our final question is, do you have any personal experiences related to this topic that you would like to share? Caitlin's going to share about some experiences using an FBA, and Katie is going to talk about her experience using an FA.
So with the FBA, the job where I work, we frequently use ABC data collection, which is a descriptive measure method for FBA, to collect information on new clients that are exhibiting problem behaviors. And then we use this data to formulate a hypothesis about the function of that behavior. So we observe it happening, we take the antecedent and the consequences, and then we use those to formulate that function. Then we develop strategies based off the hypothesized function. And for the most part, we have been fairly successful in identifying a function and using that function to choose effective strategies. There has only been some instances where the FBA kind of led us to multiple functions, or it was unclear as to what the function of the behavior was. And only in those instances did we fall back on a functional analysis. One reason is because of the training that's required. Only our BCBA is the one that's going to do the functional analysis. And with such a heavy caseload, she doesn't really have the time to do that for all of our clients. So we do the FBA first, and then if that doesn't come to a clear conclusion, then we go to the FA.
So I recently conducted an FA at the clinic I work at, and in one afternoon, about a 3-hour session, we were able to complete the FA and gather all the necessary data. Then we were able to come up with the function of the behavior, and then we were able to take that function and come up with a function-based intervention. That portion of the process took about a week, and then we began training our staff on the intervention, and we're still continuing to do that. And so far, the intervention has been pretty successful.
In conclusion, there are multiple pros and cons that can be argued to prove the effectiveness for both sides of the debate involving functional behavior assessments and functional analysis. When looking over the pros and cons that have been listed above for each side, we will determine the best action to use during a current assessment. Within the debate, there are multiple articles that have been referenced to give more information and cons that are listed. Along with the information that has been presented, there are also visuals of data, collection methods, and the differences between them. There are multiple tools and data collection methods for each side, and with visual presentations, this can also help to make a decision for each scenario that is presented. With the information that has been presented, it includes technological advancements, political, economic, and societal factors that have been discussed in the above debate. At the end of the debate, it is the question that has any of the information that has been provided changed your position on what you think in regards to a functional behavior assessment or a functional analysis?
And here are our references that have been used throughout the debate from both sides.